What happens when the disciple becomes more dangerous than the master? The story they told us is a convenient farce. They say it was a clash of egos, a scientific dispute over the nature of desire. But that is only the surface, the shadow play. The truth is much deeper and much more dangerous. The most curious part, the wound no one dares to touch, is this: the greatest rupture in modern psychology was not an intellectual debate, it was an archetypal drama. It was the son, Carl Jung, being forced to symbolically kill the father, Sigmund Freud, so that he could find himself. Freud gave us the map of the basement. He had the courage to shine a light in the darkness of our family traumas, our repressed desires, our shameful sexuality, and for that, the world changed. But he made a fatal mistake. He refused to believe there was anything above the basement. Jung, his chosen heir, dared to open the door to the cosmos. He discovered that the force that moves us, the libido, was not just the hunger of the body. It was the hunger of the soul. He discovered that beneath our personal unconscious, our private junk, there's an ocean that connects everyone, the collective unconscious. And the greatest heresy of all, he dared to say that God was not an illusion, but the most vital experience of the human psyche. Freud could not accept this. He had built an empire on the idea that man was a prisoner of his past. Jung was offering the key to the prison. This video is not a history lesson. It is a mirror. The battle waged between these two titans over a century ago is the same battle happening inside you right now. The fight between the part of you that only believes what it sees and the part of you that senses the mystery. The tension between your past that defines you and your potential that calls to you. If you're looking for easy answers, self-help pills, or another 5 tips list, please close this video. This place is not for you, but if you feel the call to a deeper truth, if you are tired of living only in the basement of your own mind, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Subscribe now. This is not a channel, it is a compass for your inner journey. Activate the bell, because every video you miss is a piece of the puzzle that will remain missing. Leave your like so that this message can find others who, like us, are seeking wholeness. And most importantly, comment the word journey below. Not for me, but for you. As a seal, a contract with your own soul that you are ready to stop just existing and start becoming who you truly are. Your journey begins now. The year was 1907, Vienna, the epicenter of an old world that was dying and a new one struggling to be born. On one side, Sigmund Freud, the master, the father of psychoanalysis, the man who had descended into the hell of the Victorian mind and returned with the map of its chains. He was Moses, about to deliver the law to an unbelieving world, but a law based not on God, but on libido. Freud was a man under siege. His ideas about infantile sexuality and the unconscious had made him a pariah. In traditional medicine, he was the king of a still small, but fiercely protected empire, an empire built on the rock of materialist reason and psychic determinism. He needed an heir. More than that, in his shadow, he needed an heir who was not Jewish, someone who could take his science to the Gentile world, someone to legitimize it beyond the Viennese circles. He needed a prince. And then, from Switzerland, came Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was not just a brilliant doctor from the prestigious Berghölzli Hospital. He was tall Aryan, charismatic, and crucially, fascinated by Freud's ideas. But Jung brought with him something that Freud, in his focused genius, did not possess: a soul open to mystery. Jung's father was a Protestant pastor whose faith had died, leaving the young Carl in a spiritual vacuum. Jung was seeking a new father, a master who could give meaning not just to neurosis, but to existence. When the two first met, the connection was immediate, explosive. They spoke for 13 hours straight. It was not a meeting of two men, it was the collision of two eras. Freud saw in Jung the ideal son, the heir who would complete his work, the Joshua who would lead his people to the promised land. Jung saw in Freud the father figure he had never had, the master who finally gave him permission to explore the dark territories of the psyche. The transference was immediate and mutual. Freud anointed Jung as his crown prince, the future of psychoanalysis. But this anointing already contained the seed of betrayal. The throne Freud offered was also a prison. He demanded absolute loyalty. Loyalty, specifically to his theory of sexuality as the sole cause of neurosis, the single engine of the psyche. Freud had turned his discovery into a dogma, a weapon against the black tide of occultism that he so feared. And it was exactly this tide that fascinated Jung. Jung was already exploring myths, alchemy, the delusions of psychotics, and saw patterns in them that could not be reduced to the childhood sexual drama. He saw a much larger, more ancient psychology. Jung's father complex made him accept the crown, but his inner calling, his daemon, already knew he would have to renounce it. Freud's shadow, his need for control, his fear of the irrational, his dogmatism would create in the son the very rebellion he most feared. Fate was sealed. The alliance that seemed destined to redefine the 20th century was, in fact, the archetypal setting for the greatest and most necessary betrayal in the history of modern thought. The son would have to kill the father to become himself. The first great fracture, the tremor that would shake the temple's foundations. To understand the rupture, one must understand the word libido. For Sigmund Freud, this word was his central pillar, his most courageous and outrageous discovery. In a puritanical and repressed Vienna, Freud had the audacity to declare that the primary engine of human life was not reason or divine will, but the sexual drive. Libido, for him, was unequivocally sexual energy. From the baby at the mother's breast to the artist creating his work, everything was a manifestation, direct or sublimated, of this fundamental biological force. Our dreams, our neuroses, our symptoms, all were hieroglyphs of repressed sexual desire. The Oedipus complex was the central tragedy. This theory was Freud's rock. It was, in his own words, the dogma that could not be questioned. To accept it was to be a psychoanalyst. To doubt it was to be a heretic. And Jung, the crown prince, began to doubt. Jung's doubt was not born of morality or cowardly puritanism, as Freud would come to accuse him. On the contrary, it was born from the clinic, from empirical observation. While working with severe psychotic patients, Jung saw explosions of energy and symbols that simply did not fit the sexual model. How to explain the cosmic delusions of a schizophrenic, replete with solar myths and divine sacrifices, as merely frustrated Oedipal fantasy? It seemed reductive, poor. Jung began to feel that Freud had mistaken a part for the whole. He began to formulate a much broader and much more dangerous idea. What if libido was not just sexual? What if the sexual drive was just one manifestation of a much vaster and more fundamental energy? Jung proposed that libido was, in essence, psychic energy, the undifferentiated life force, the will to live, the hunger to create, the impetus for growth, the search for meaning. It was Bergson's élan vital, Schopenhauer's will. Sexuality was an important channel for this energy, yes, but not the only one. Creativity, spirituality, power, all were equally valid channels. To Freud, this was treason, a heresy. He accused Jung of diluting psychoanalysis, of making it palatable to the religious masses, of castrating its revolutionary power for fear of facing the dirty truth of human nature. Freud saw himself as a conquistador who had claimed a dark territory, and Jung was trying to clean up that territory, denying its true nature. But for Jung, it was Freud who was trapped in 19th century materialism, blinded by his own theory. Jung saw that Freud's obsessive insistence on sexuality was, itself, a symptom, a worldview limited by his own complex. The true neurosis of the modern era, Jung was beginning to realize, was not repressed sexuality, it was meaninglessness. People were not sick because they couldn't have sex, they were sick because they didn't know why they lived. The hunger was not of the body, it was of the soul. This divergence was not academic, it was existential. If libido is only sex, the goal of therapy is to adjust the individual to their impulses. But if libido is psychic energy, the goal of therapy becomes something much greater. It is to help the individual find their meaning, to realize their unique potential, to individuate. The fight over libido was the first battle for the soul of modern man. Freud wanted to free us from our sexual guilt. Jung wanted to free us from our meaningless prison. If the battle over libido was the first fracture, the discovery of the collective unconscious was the earthquake that brought the building down. This is, perhaps, Jung's most monumental contribution, and the final, absolute breaking point with Freud. For Freud, the unconscious was strictly personal. It was a dark basement, a repository formed throughout an individual's life. It contained repressed memories, forbidden desires, forgotten traumas, and infantile fantasies, mostly of a sexual or aggressive nature. The mind, at birth, was a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and the unconscious was what we wrote on it and later tried to erase. The task of psychoanalysis was archaeology, to excavate this personal basement, bring the repressed material to the light of consciousness, and thus alleviate the neurosis. Freud's work was biographical, but Jung, in his work with psychotics and in his obsessive study of mythology, alchemy, and comparative religions, began to notice something disturbing. His patients, often uneducated people, produced delusions and symbols identical to those found in ancient myths from cultures with which they had never had contact. One schizophrenic patient described the sun as having a phallus, from which the wind came, an image Jung, years later, found in a Greek Mithraic papyrus. How was this possible? Freud's answer would be cryptomnesia, hidden memory, the idea that the patient heard or read it somewhere and forgot. But for Jung, this explanation was weak and insufficient. The recurrence of these symbols was systematic, universal. Jung's answer was radical. Beneath the personal unconscious, that thin layer of our repressed biography, there exists a much deeper, vaster, and more ancient layer. A layer that is not individual, but collective. An unconscious that is not formed by our personal experience, but which we inherit. We are born with it. It is the psychic substrate common to all humanity. If consciousness is the small island where we live, and the personal unconscious is the soil of that island just below the surface, the collective unconscious is the vast subterranean ocean that connects all the islands. It is the psychic inheritance of human evolution, the deposit of all ancestral experience. We do not inherit memories, but rather patterns, tendencies, predispositions to experience the world in certain ways. And the language of this deep ocean, the archetypes. To Freud, this was pure mysticism. It was the black tide of occultism he so feared. It was a betrayal of science, a regression to religious thought. Psychoanalysis, for Freud, had to be a materialist, biological science. The idea of an inherited, collective psyche was anathema. The tension became unbearable. Freud saw Jung as a dangerous mystic, abandoning science for fantasy. Jung saw Freud as a stubborn rationalist, a man blinded by his own theory, trapped in a reductive nothing-butness. Jung realized that Freud had mistaken the basement personal unconscious for the foundation of the house collective unconscious. The discovery of the collective unconscious changed everything. It meant that we are not blank slates. It meant that we carry within us the myths, the gods, the demons, the heroes, and the sages of our entire species. It meant that psychology is not just about childhood trauma, but about the eternal drama of the human soul. And it meant that healing is not just about resolving the Oedipus complex, but about reconnecting with this primordial source of wisdom and energy. Freud wanted to make us normal. Jung wanted to make us whole. If the collective unconscious is the deep ocean, the archetypes are its eternal currents. They are the organs of the psyche, the primordial forms that structure our experience. This was the logical consequence of Jung's discovery, and a concept that Freud simply could not and would not accept. What is an archetype? It is not an inherited image. We are not born with the image of a specific mother. We are born with the archetype of the mother, an innate predisposition to experience, and form an image of a maternal figure, which will shape our relationship with our real mother and, later, with everything that represents nourishment, protection, or, in its dark aspect, devouring. The archetypes are the universal patterns of human drama. The hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the tyrant father, the divine child, the trickster, and, crucially, the shadow, the anima, the inner feminine in man, and the animus, the inner masculine in woman. These are not concepts we learn. They are potentialities we live. They are the gods and demons of ancient myths, which, according to Jung, never disappeared. They just stopped being projected onto Olympus and now inhabit, unseen, our unconscious. For Freud, these patterns, when they appeared, were derivatives of the family drama. The tyrant father was just a generalization of the real father and the Oedipus complex. The great mother was a substitute for the maternal breast. Freud was always reducing the symbol to a sign of something known, usually sex or family. A dream of a snake, for a Freudian, is almost invariably a phallic symbol, a sign for the penis. To Jung, this was a tragic impoverishment. A symbol is not a sign. A sign points to something known. A symbol points to mystery, to something that cannot be fully expressed in any other way. The snake could be a phallus, yes, but it could also be the archetype of chthonic wisdom, of healing the caduceus of Asclepius, of betrayal Eden, of renewal the shedding of skin, or of kundalini energy. To reduce everything to the phallus was, for Jung, the nothing but psychology. The real difference is this, for Freud. Myths were products of society's sexual repression. Oedipus Rex was an example of the universal desire for incest. For Jung, it was the opposite. Our personal complexes are just individual manifestations of the great archetypal dramas. The myth does not come from the family. The family is our first arena for living the myth. This view radically changed the goal of therapy. The work was no longer just resolving the father complex. It was understanding which archetype was activated in our life. Are you living the myth of the hero? Or are you trapped in the myth of the poor Oedipus, the eternal child? Are you being devoured by the terrible aspect of the mother? Have you integrated your shadow, or is it being projected, making you hate in others what you fail to see in yourself? Freud saw the mind as a problem to be solved. Jung saw the mind as a story to be lived. The gods that Freud declared dead or reduced to neuroses, Jung found alive and pulsating in the depths of the psyche. Freud's refusal to accept this mythical reality was a refusal to accept the richest dimension of human experience. He gave us a psychology for the drawing room. Jung gave us a psychology for the cosmos. Here, the divergence transcends psychology and touches the heart of human existence. The final battle between Jung and Freud was fought on the territory of God. For Sigmund Freud, the staunch atheist, religion was the great obsessive neurosis of humanity. It was a childish illusion, wishful thinking. God was nothing more than an exalted projection of the father figure, a cosmic father we invent to protect us from the helplessness we feel before the impersonal forces of nature and the terrifying certainty of death. The religious experience was, for Freud, a symptom of regression, an escape from reality. The future of humanity, he wrote in The Future of an Illusion, depended on overcoming this neurosis and embracing logos, or scientific reason. Psychoanalysis was the antidote to religion. For Carl Jung, this view was a disaster. Jung was the son of a Protestant pastor, a man whose faith had evaporated into doubt, leaving him bitter and impotent. Jung grew up in a house where religion was a dead form, a set of dogmas that no longer touched the soul. He lost his Christian faith early, but he never lost his intense search for the experience of the divine, which he called the numinous. In his travels, in the study of alchemy, and especially in his patience, Jung discovered something Freud refused to see. The human being has a religious instinct. Just as we have an instinct for sex or aggression, we have an instinct for meaning. The psyche, Jung said, has an innate religious function. The modern neurosis, he concluded, was not caused by sexual repression, as Freud insisted. The modern neurosis was the sickness of emptiness, of meaninglessness. It was the sickness of a soul that had lost its connection to myth, to symbol, to the sacred. Modern man was sick because he had killed his gods and found nothing to put in their place, except consumption, power, or sterile reason. The question for Jung was not whether God exists objectively in heaven. That was a theological question, and he was an empirical psychologist. The question was that the experience of God, the image of God in the psyche, was an undeniable psychological fact and the most powerful force for transformation and healing he had ever witnessed. When his patients found a greater meaning for their lives, a purpose that transcended their small egos, their neuroses often disappeared. The goal of individuation, Jung's central process, is the union of opposites conscious and unconscious, and the archetype that symbolizes this totality is the self, the inner image of God. Freud demanded that Jung make the sexual theory a dogma, a bulwark against the black tide of occultism. Jung saw the tragic irony in this. Freud, the great iconoclast, was creating his own dogmatic religion, with sexuality as its new almighty God. Jung could not accept this. He could not sacrifice the soul's search for wholeness on the altar of loyalty to a master who saw spirituality as mere pathology. Freud wanted to save us from God. Jung wanted to save us from a world without God, a world without meaning. This was the definitive rupture, for it was not about a technical detail. It was about the ultimate purpose of human life. For Sigmund Freud, the Oedipus complex was not a theory, it was the theory. It was the cornerstone of his entire system, the central drama of the human condition. Everything began and ended there, in childhood. The boy unconsciously desires the mother and sees the father as a rival to be eliminated, fearing. In return, castration. The girl, in turn, suffers penis envy and turns to the father, rejecting the mother. For Freud, the way a child navigated or failed to navigate this family triangle determined their entire adult life, their love choices, their neuroses and perversions. All of culture, religion, and society were, ultimately, complex sublimations of this primordial family sexual drama. Jung, at first, accepted Oedipus. He saw it as a powerful description of a common dynamic. But over time, he began to see it the same way he saw sexual libido. It was true, but it was not the whole truth. It was a provincial description, limited to the drama of the Viennese bourgeois family. Freud had taken a particular case and turned it into a universal law. Jung's first objection was practical. What bound the child to the mother was not primarily incestuous sexual desire. It was the need for protection, nourishment, the comfort of a lost paradise. It was a nostalgia for primordial union. The incest, for Jung, was a symbol. It was not the concrete desire to cohabit with the biological mother, but rather a spiritual desire to return to the womb, to the source, to the collective unconscious, in order to be reborn. It was a desire for individuation, not sexual gratification. The second objection was archetypal. Freud was fixated on the myth of Oedipus. But why that myth? The collective unconscious is replete with other myths. What about the myth of the hero, who must leave the mother to find his destiny? What about the myth of Persephone, abducted into the underworld? Jung realized that Freud was blinded by the tyrant father archetype Uranus, Kronos, and ignored the equally vast, and perhaps more primordial, power of the great mother archetype. For Jung, the central problem for many of his patients, especially men, was not fear of the father castration, but fear of the mother, the fear of being devoured, swallowed, sucked back into unconsciousness, the fear of never becoming an individual. It was the mother complex, not the Oedipus complex, that kept them weak, passive, unable to act in the world. Freud's Oedipus was literal. The boy wants the mother and fears the father. Jung's Oedipus was symbolic. The conscious ego, the son, must free itself from the regressive pull of the unconscious, the mother, so as not to be castrated, lose its potency and consciousness by the dark aspect of the world, the tyrant father, or the rules of society. The difference is colossal. Freud's view traps us in our family history. Jung's view invites us to see our family as the first arena where the great archetypal dramas unfold. Freud's obsession with Oedipus became a theoretical prison. He tried to shove all the complexity of the human soul into this small, dark box. Jung simply refused to stay trapped in there. He saw that as long as Oedipus is the only story we tell, we are doomed to repeat the past. For Jung, the goal was not to resolve Oedipus, but to transcend it, moving from the family drama to the mythical hero's journey, the journey of individuation. In 1909, during one of Jung's visits to Vienna, the tension between the two men was already palpable. The debate over libido was at its peak, and Jung's reluctance to accept the sexual dogma was enraging Freud. But it was a strange, almost supernatural incident that exposed the open wound between the rationalist and the mystic. They were in Freud's library, debating fervently. Jung was defending his growing interest in occultism, parapsychology, and phenomena that Freud's rationalist science summarily dismissed. Freud, irritated, scorned it, calling it atide and mysticism. He rebuked Jung, insisting that psychoanalysis must remain scientific. Jung, feeling the heavy atmosphere and Freud's dogmatic resistance, recounts in his autobiography that he felt his diaphragm become hot as if it were glowing. At that exact moment, a loud, dry crack sounded from the bookcase next to them, startling them both. Jung, on impulse, turned to Freud and said, "There you are, Herr Professor. That is an example of what I am talking about, a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon." Freud, pale and shocked, retorted, "Nonsense. That is absurd." Jung, feeling a strange and absolute confidence, challenged the master, "It is not absurd. And to prove it, I say that there will be another crack right now." He had barely finished speaking when a second, even louder, crack echoed from the same bookcase. Freud, according to Jung, looked at me with a dumbfounded amazement. This event, which Freud later tried to rationalize, and which Jung himself never fully explained, became a symbolic watershed. For Jung, it was empirical, lived proof that there were more things in heaven and earth than Freud's materialist philosophy could dream of. It was validation that the psyche was not contained within the skull, that it could interact with reality in mysterious ways, what he would later call synchronicity. It was proof that his mystical path was not a fantasy, but a reality to be explored. For Freud, the incident was terrifying. He saw it as the very personification of the irrational tide he so feared. He saw in Jung not a scientist, but a shaman, someone who was opening the doors to chaos. In a later letter, Freud confessed to Jung his fear that an interest in the occult would destroy their life's work. Freud's fear was not just scientific, it was personal. He, the great explorer of the unconscious, had his own shadow, a deep fear of the irrational, the uncontrollable, the numinous. The poltergeist incident in the library was not the cause of the rupture, but it was its most acute symptom. It exposed the fundamental incompatibility of their natures. Freud was the man of causality, looking backward, to the trauma, to the rational explanation. Jung was the man of finality and synchronicity, looking forward, to the meaning, to the mysterious connection of events. Freud wanted to dissect the ghost to prove it was false. Jung wanted to ask the ghost what it had come to teach him. From that day on, Freud looked at Jung with suspicion, seeing in him a threat to reason itself. And Jung looked at Freud with a new clarity, seeing not an infallible master, but a brilliant, yet limited, man, a prisoner of his own fear of the mystery. The end was not a single event, but a long and agonizing divorce waged over hundreds of pages of correspondence. The letters between Freud and Jung, which began with feverish intellectual admiration and paternal affection, degenerated into a psychological battlefield. The tension over libido and occultism transformed into personal accusations, shadow projections, and an archetypal power struggle. Freud, the father, demanded loyalty. Jung, the son, demanded freedom. Freud began to treat Jung not as a colleague, but as a patient. He interpreted Jung's theoretical disagreements as symptoms of his resistance, of his own unresolved complexes, suggesting Jung was acting out his father complex against him. In a famous letter, Freud wrote, "Do not ask that my agreement be the sole basis of our friendship." But in practice, that was exactly what he demanded. The atmosphere became suffocating. Jung felt he was being forced into an intellectual submission that violated his integrity. The personal breaking point came in 1912. Freud had written an article about a case, mentioning a patient who had a vision of a solar phallus, the same vision Jung's psychotic patient had described. Freud, however, used this to reinforce his sexual theory, linking it to infantile fantasies, completely ignoring the mythical and collective implications Jung had pointed out. For Jung, this was the final blow. It was a deliberate distortion, an act of intellectual bad faith to protect his dogma. Jung responded with a letter that was a declaration of psychological warfare. He began to analyze Freud. He accused Freud of having a power complex and of treating his students like patients. And then he delivered the blow that would kill the relationship. He wrote, "Your technique of treating your pupils as patients is a blunder. You see a symptom in every act. Meanwhile, you remain comfortably on top as the father." By using the word father, Jung was consciously pointing to the Oedipus complex that Freud saw everywhere. But the real explosion came in Jung's next letter, in December 1912. He attacked Freud's own neurosis, his inability to handle power, his dogmatism. He wrote that Freud reduced everyone to his authority. Freud's response was cold and deadly. In January 1913, he wrote, "I propose, therefore, that we abandon our personal relations entirely. I lose nothing by this, for I have long been bound to you by a thin thread of affection." The divorce was finalized. For Jung, this exchange of letters was more than the end of a friendship. It was the symbolic murder of the father. It was the necessary act of rebellion that freed him from the master's shadow. But the price was terrible. By killing the figure of Freud, Jung was plunged into inner chaos. He lost his mentor, his community, the psychoanalytic movement, and his intellectual framework. He was completely alone on the abyss of his own unconscious. The epistolary rupture was the death of Jung, the crown prince, and the terrifying birth of Jung, the individual. What happens when you symbolically kill your intellectual father and the world he represented? You fall. After the final break with Freud in 1913, Carl Jung entered the darkest and, paradoxically, most fertile period of his life. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious or his creative illness. The outside world saw him as a man who had committed professional suicide. He resigned from his posts in the psychoanalytic movement, isolated himself from his colleagues, and was considered an apostate, a delusional mystic. But what was happening inside was the validation of everything he had intuited. Having lost Freud's external structure, Jung was forced to find his own internal structure. And to do that, he had to dive headfirst into the very ocean that Freud feared, the collective unconscious. He began to have terrifying visions, apocalyptic dreams of a Europe covered in blood and ice, visions that, to his horror, became reality months later with the outbreak of World War I. He heard voices. He felt the presence of figures in his house. He was, by any clinical definition of the time, on the verge of psychosis. A Freudian would say he was suffering a neurotic breakdown, a regression caused by the loss of the father figure. But Jung knew this was not it. He was not sick. He was on a journey. He was doing what no modern psychologist had dared to do. He was mapping the unconscious by living it from the inside. He developed a technique he called active imagination. Instead of fleeing the visions, he dove into them. He conversed with the figures from his dreams and fantasies. He met Philemon, a wise old man figure with kingfisher wings, who became his inner guide, his guru. He met Salome, a seductive and blind anima figure. He confronted his own shadow. He was, in effect, doing to himself what shamans and mystics do, a descent into the underworld to retrieve the fragments of the soul. This entire terrifying and luminous period was meticulously recorded in a series of secret diaries, calligraphed and illustrated with mandalas and paintings of his visions. This document, known today as the Red Book Liber Novus, is the central artifact of modern psychology. It is not a book about Jung's theory. It is the raw material from which all of his later theory was forged. Analytical psychology was not born in a sterile office. It was born from fire, individuation, the archetypes, the self, the shadow, the anima. All these concepts were not invented by Jung. They were found by him during this descent into chaos. He had to get lost in the collective unconscious to prove it existed. He had to face his own demons to prove that integrating the shadow was the path to wholeness. He had to find his inner guide, Philemon, to prove the archetype of the wise old man was real. The break with Freud, therefore, was the most necessary act of Jung's life. It was the sacrifice that forced him to stop being a disciple who analyzed others and transformed him into a master who had traversed his own hell. Freud gave Jung the map of the coastline, but the rupture forced him to build his own ship and sail the unknown ocean. More than a century has passed, but the rupture between Freud and Jung is not a historical relic. It is the source code of the modern soul's dilemma. Their battle continues to be waged, not in Vienna, but inside your own mind every day. We live in an overwhelmingly Freudian world. Our culture is obsessed with diagnosis, pathology, trauma. We reduce art to the artist's symptom, love to brain chemistry, spirituality to evolutionary psychology. We are taught to look backward, to what our parents did to us, to the childhood wound, to the why of our brokenness. This is Freud's legacy, a psychology of the basement, focused on what is wrong, what was repressed, the determinism of the past. And it is vital. We need that clarity. We need to understand our traumas, but it is incomplete. Jung's legacy, on the other hand, is the legacy of potential. It is the psychology of the cosmos. It doesn't just ask why are you sick. It asks what purpose does this sickness serve? What is the meaning of your suffering? What myth are you living? To what wholeness is your symptom pointing? Jung's vision does not deny the Freudian basement, but it refuses to believe that is all we are. It invites us to climb the stairs, to acknowledge the shadow, yes, but also to seek the self. Where Freud offers analysis, Jung offers meaning. Today, you stand at that crossroads. You can choose the Freudian view. You are a complex biological machine, a product of your traumas and drives, and your goal is adjustment and the reduction of displeasure. Or you can embrace the Jungian view. You are a symbolic being, a carrier of a spark of the collective unconscious, and your goal is not adjustment, but individuation, the journey to become the unique, whole, and authentic being you were born to be, even if it means pain and conflict. The rupture does not force us to choose a side. It forces us to recognize that we are both. We need the Freudian courage to look at our personal junk, our sexual and family complexes, but we desperately need the Jungian courage to look beyond that, to find our myth, to dialogue with our soul, to find a greater meaning in the journey. The great neurosis of our time, as Jung predicted, is not sex, it is emptiness. And no analysis of the past, no matter how brilliant, can fill a void of meaning. Only the journey inward can. The fight between Freud and Jung is not over. It has just moved to a new battlefield, your heart. And how you navigate this tension will define the destiny of your soul.